Before we dive into this presentation, I want to say a few words about context. When we talk about academic integrity and plagiarism in this class, we do so through the lens of an individualist culture, namely that of the United States. The U.S. is known for placing great value on the individual, which is why it might not be surprising to find that our intellectual property laws are some of the toughest in the world. People from collectivist cultures may have a different set of laws, but their values are equally valid in their respective contexts. However, because we're in a US-based institution, we'll follow the US Code of Conduct when it comes to academic integrity. Simply put, in US institutions, plagiarism is considered unethical and the punishment for it can often be very serious. In my experience, most students are honest people and they don't intend to break the rules. Rarely do I find egregious instances of plagiarism where a student has copied an entire paper. What I find instead is a student that has written a paper that is almost plagiarism-free, save for a few simple mistakes. Here are the most common trouble spots for students. The first one, forgetting to name your source. Remember, what's clear to you may not be clear to your reader, so when in doubt, always refer to your source directly by name. Another unintentional form of plagiarism can come if you forget to use parenthetical citations. So remember, even if you name the source and you use quotation marks, you still need an in-text citation. This is also called the parenthetical citation. And finally, not using quotation marks when repeating a string of words. This is probably the one that happens the most frequently. As a general rule of thumb, if you repeat 3 or more words without using quotation marks, this could be considered plagiarism. However, it should be noted that in the case of common words or technical titles, things that cannot be stated any other way without sounding awkward, the 3-word rule may not hold. However, remember that when it comes to plagiarism, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So when in doubt, protect yourself against plagiarism by using quotation marks whenever you're repeating any string of 3 or more words that the author used in the original text. As your professor, I want to set you up for academic success in the future. As a scholar, you'll be expected to write papers and conduct your research in a way that's ethical and adheres to institutional expectations. Even if you committed what you believe to be a minor unintentional error, you can still face the consequences of plagiarism. In most cases, professors will fail you for the assignment, and if it happens more than once, a professor might fail you for the class. In some extreme cases, a student can be expelled from school for plagiarism. Fortunately, this class is designed to help you avoid plagiarism and the steep penalties that come with it. So here's the million-dollar question. How can I avoid plagiarism? I want you to pause this presentation and think about it for a few moments. Here are the steps that I would recommend you take to avoid plagiarism. First and foremost, give yourself enough time to do your work. Plagiarism is often the result of unintentional errors made in haste. Secondly, try putting the text away and writing a cold description in your own words. As social creatures, we sometimes internalize the language of those around us without even being aware of it. This is why it's a good idea to step away from the text and do something else before you try to summarize or paraphrase. And remember, when summarizing or paraphrasing, pretend that you're explaining the reading to a close friend. This will help you to use your natural language. Next, you can avoid plagiarism by running your assignment through a plagiarism checker, such as Turnitin. Now, I do want you to know that plagiarism checkers sometimes aren't accurate, but in most cases they work pretty well, and you should be aware that your professors will be using them. Next, I would recommend that you use quotation marks around every unique word or phrase that did not come from you. So overusing quotations in a paper can become a problem, but this problem is minor when compared with the issue of plagiarism. So when in doubt, put quotation marks around any language that is replicated from the original text. And then finally, the most important step that you can take to avoid plagiarism is by using frames. And frame is a way of saying source references and citations, and I'll explain that later in the presentation. I've bolded and underlined this last tip because I think it's the best way to ensure that you're not accidentally plagiarizing. Framing is what we'll focus on for the remainder of this lesson. Now I want you to imagine that two students are referring to an idea from an outside source. I want you to pause this presentation and consider which student's reference is more effective, student A or student B. If you said student B, you already have an intuitive understanding of the value of framing. Because both of the students are paraphrasing, it's difficult to tell where the student's ideas end and the source's ideas begin. In this slide, I've bolded and underlined the frame, which, as you can see, clearly encloses the ideas that belong to the source. Just as a frame encloses a picture, you can use your own words and parenthetical citations to frame all references to outside sources. The frame is a great thing because it clearly separates the words and ideas of your author from your own words and ideas. The basic formula for a frame is simple. At the top of the frame, you'll want to clearly name your source, and the bottom of the frame will close out with an in-text or parenthetical citation that gives the reader more information about the location of the particular idea that you're referring to. To give you a more concrete example, you're going to introduce your source with a verb that captures your rhetorical angle. So if you want to remain neutral, you can use the verb states, says, communicates, examines, etc. Those are all very neutral ways to introduce your source. But to make a subtle commentary, you might add adjectives or choose more vivid verbs. So if you introduce your source with the verb complains, or if you say convincingly supports, or if you say asserts without evidence, you're obviously putting a little bit of a rhetorical spin in there, which may or may not be appropriate depending on your purpose. In this slide, the bottom of the frame is a parenthetical citation. It's just a number, which means that it's a page number from a book. Before we move on, I just want to make one distinction about the top of the frame. When you first introduce the source, it's a good idea to quickly reference the source's authority or expertise. After all, an idea from a source that isn't credible won't really carry the same weight as an idea from somebody who is a credible expert in that field. However, when you're referring to the same source more than once in the same paragraph, you can use a shortened frame. After all, it would be clunky and repetitive to continue to state the expertise of Cornel West once your readers are already aware of this. So when referring to the same source more than once in the same paragraph, you can usually use the author's last name or a personal pronoun. Now I'd like to say a few words about the bottom of the frame. In our class, we'll be using MLA, which stands for the Modern Language Association. MLA is a flexible documentation system, and this means that you get to decide what information you should include in the parenthetical citation. So there's a number of different options that you have. The basic thing that you want to remember is that you keep your citation short and you don't repeat any information that the reader may already know. Usually, the parenthetical citation is used to note the specific location of the words or ideas to which you're referring. In the examples on this slide, I've included a few options. You can state the page number, which is just a number. You can state the paragraph number if it's an article. In that case, it's PAR period and then the number. You can state the title, or you can state the date of publication. These are the most common ways to close out the frame. But like I said before, don't repeat anything that your reader already knows. You want to keep your parenthetical citations short and sweet. Okay, so it's time for some practice. This original passage was written by Carolyn F.E. Spurgeon, and she wrote a book titled Shakespeare's Imagery. It was taken from page 335. Spurgeon writes, The main image in Othello is that of animals in action, preying upon one another, mischievous, lascivious, cruel, or suffering, and through these, the general sense of pain and unpleasantness is much increased and kept constantly before us. So that's what Spurgeon wrote. The student summarized what Spurgeon wrote by writing this. Shakespeare's use of animal images heightens the general sense of pain and unpleasantness that pervades the play. Now, I want you to think for a moment, did this student plagiarize from the original passage? If you said yes, you're correct. This student's work is clearly plagiarized for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that there's no frame. There's no reference to the author before the idea and no parenthetical citation after the idea. The second issue is that the student has copied a string of words from the original text and the student did not enclose those words in quotation marks. Both of these things are problematic and would qualify as plagiarism. Okay, let's look at the same passage from Shakespeare's imagery, but this time let's assume that a different student has written the summary. Please consider whether this second student has also plagiarized. Again, the original passage from Spurgeon is as follows. The main image in Othello is that of animals in action, preying upon one another, mischievous, lascivious, cruel, or suffering, and through these the general sense of pain and unpleasantness is much increased and kept constantly before us. So the student summarizes Spurgeon by writing this. Spurgeon believes that Shakespeare's use of animal images heightens the, quote, general sense of pain and unpleasantness that pervades the play. And you'll notice there's a parenthetical citation for page 335. Now take a moment to consider, did this second student also plagiarize? If you said no, you are correct. There are a few important reasons why this summary would not be considered plagiarism. First and foremost, the summary is framed, and you'll see the frame is underlined and bolded in blue. Secondly, the summary uses original language, and anytime the student repeats the words of the original source, they are enclosed in quotation marks. All of these things protect this student against plagiarism. Sometimes you will need to make slight alterations to the quotation as it originally appeared in the text when you integrate it into your own writing. You can shorten quotes, you can change the verb tense, you can add points of clarification within the quotation. If you are doing those things, you can use square brackets anytime you're altering or adding words. If you're omitting words, use the ellipses. Now remember, when you change a quotation, make sure that you're not seriously altering the meaning of the quotation. So it's fine to alter quotations as long as the meaning is consistent. So I am not going to make this class all about MLA. We will be using MLA, but what I hope to do is really emphasize the principles that you can take and apply in your other classes. So regardless of what documentation format you're using, you should always use frames and citations in any discipline. Congratulations, you've made it to the end of this lesson, and by now you know how to avoid plagiarism. You're going to use frames to clearly signal any outside information, and you're always going to close your frame out with a parenthetical citation.